Mysterious haunted cornfields. Let's look at an area of haunted phenomena that is truly creepy. A cornfield is one of the most strange places to encounter something from beyond comprehension. Here we have rows upon rows of these stalks slowly swaying in the wind, holding who knows what within the pockets of shadow between them. These seem to be places destined for creepy tales of the strange, and there are indeed many such stories making the rounds out there. So let's go right in, push those corn stalks aside, venture into the murk within, and see what we find. There is all manner of strange reports of things materializing from between the stalks, and in most of these, the entity seems to be of a rather menacing and sinister variety. Take the report from Reddit user Throw2398065, who says this happened one evening as he drove along US 40, about 25 miles west of Indianapolis at around midnight. Anyone who drives that way knows that that route is just miles and miles of cornfields, and since it was a very routine drive and a summer drive, I was spending more time looking out the window for deer than anything else. In searching for deer, I caught some eye shine and slowed down to about 35 miles per hour, but I noticed that the shine I saw was a more orange fiery color than normal for a deer. As I got to within about 30 yards, I could see it wasn't a deer producing the eye shine, but a strange gray mass sitting at the edge of the cornfield just before the tree line. When I got about 20 yards away, it stood up. I was still confused as to what exactly I was looking at until it stood all the way up, and it was only about 8 feet outside of my passenger window. It appeared to be a gray, emaciated man dressed in a Great Depression-era suit with a brown fedora, with fire for eyes and nothing for a face. He looked to be about 8 feet tall, and it just felt like he was staring into my skull. And as he started to pass behind me, I watched him turn and casually step back into the cornfield and vanish. One wonders just what that otherworldly thing could have possibly been. From the state of Illinois comes the account of a witness who says that her own encounter happened while driving with her husband along a dark and lonely rural road in central Illinois that passed right through an expanse of cornfields on both sides. It was described as a clear summer evening, and as the stalks blurred by them in a hypnotic cycle, something would give them quite a jolt. She says, "Something ran across the road in front of me. It was about the size of a toddler, but it looked like a skeleton, or so skinny, its limbs were about the size of a skeleton. It was also bone white and very fast. I have been through college, I have a Bachelor of Science and have taken biology classes as well as zoology. That creature was something I'd never seen before. My husband looked ahead just as it left the road and said he just saw something but couldn't describe it." There are other accounts of thin, pale entities lurking about cornfields as well. A very creepy encounter was reported on ThoughtCo, and is told by a witness named Frank Semko, who says he once worked at a rural cheese factory in the state of Minnesota that stood right up against a vast sea of corn. In the summer of 2004, he says, he was on a break on a night shift, looking out over the forlorn cornfield and watching bats flit about when something very unearthly caught his eye. He says of the surreal sequence of events that would follow. "As I was watching the bats, I looked down at the edge of the cornfield. Something was moving there. It was the size of a small child and very, very skinny. Pale, with something that looked like a head of straight, black hair. It moved in a sort of jerky gait, like someone dancing the robot badly. It moved in chunks, legs, then hips, then torso, shoulders, neck, and finally the head. It was looking back into the cornfield, or at least I felt like it was. I felt prickly all over. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a heron or something at first, but it looked too much like a person. It didn't move like a person, though. Gradually, step by step, it moved toward me. Letting my curiosity overcome my fear, I moved toward the edge of the dock, which was raised a few feet off the ground. When I got within a few feet of the edge, the thing looked at me. I was paralyzed. I could have run, but I was stuck somewhere between terrified and intrigued. It moved, but its face was still pointed at me. It ratcheted its body in that disconcerting, jerky movement toward the cornfield and went into it. I tried to watch where the field moved as it passed, but the corn remained perfectly still. I noticed that all the crickets were silent. After a few minutes, nothing happened. I stood out there for an hour, but it never came back. I never saw it again. Were these pale creatures ghosts, demons, or something else? One case that certainly seems to be rather demonic in nature is a report from a witness named Jennifer Lozano, on True Ghost Tales, who says that she had her frightening experience in Indiana, where she lived in a modest house on top of a large hill, behind which sat acres and acres of cornfield and woods stretching out all around. It would have been an inherently spooky place as it was, but it was about to get even more so. One evening, she had taken a walk in the cornfields and woods nearby, and she describes it as mostly a peaceful hike, that is, until she was heading back. She says of the horrifying sequence of events that would play out. I was walking back and I caught a fast flash of something all black moving behind a tree in the woods. I stopped and looked, and at first, I didn't see anything, so I began walking again, but after a few steps, I saw it again and this time it didn't hide. What I saw that day was not only unexplainable, it was pure evil in a form. It stood there looking at me and its head and neck hung to the side in a very abnormal way, as if it was broken. It stood about 4 feet tall, and its arms were very long and hung all the way to the ground. It looked as if its entire body was burned or very thick like skin, and it had no hair or ears on its head. Then I noticed that steam was rolling off this thing like crazy, and it then let out this loud scream that scared me so badly that I began to run full speed through the field towards the house. I felt as if my heart was going to beat out of my chest and I could hear the leaves crunching as this thing was definitely coming after me. I had about a million things going through my mind at this point, and I was wondering what would happen to me if this thing did catch up with me. I gave a quick glance back and I saw it closer than it had been and gaining speed as it was using its long arms to help it run, kind of like a gorilla would. It's also letting out this gurgling sort of scream that I can't quite explain. Finally, I reached the house and began to tell my mother what had happened. I hadn't even finished when we both heard something pounding on the outside of the house. We both began to scream and cry, and it sounded as if it was going to beat the walls down. After an hour of tormenting us, this thing just stopped, and when my dad got home, my mom and I told him what happened. I was sure he would never believe us, but to my complete surprise, he went and got some other people and his hunting rifle and went looking for the creature. Of course, they never caught it, and after a year went by, my dad and I were outside one night talking and it came up in our conversation. He told me that the reason he knew we were telling the truth was that 2 nights before that, he was burning some leaves out back and he saw it standing in the middle of the field and heard it screaming like a banshee. Also rather spooky is a Reddit user called EmilithNico13, who says she had a friend who lived alone at a house skirted by miles of cornfields. Interestingly, the friend had always been afraid of the fields, as she believed them to be prowled by malevolent entities that she had actually seen on several occasions. The witness here had never really believed these tales until one night as they were out driving. She says, "My friend has always had a fear of cornfields, and no matter how many times I ask her, she refuses to tell me why. Her husband did tell me that it's because of something called corn demons. On this particular night, she wanted to visit her mom since we were going to be nearby. Her mom still lives in the same house that my friend grew up in, which is in a heavily wooded area by a lake, out in the country. As we were leaving, she turned, and we started driving past a cornfield. I was about to comment on how high the corn was when my friend suddenly smacked my leg. "Do not look in the corn." She sounded very serious, but despite myself, I glanced over. There were a pair of red eyes in the corn, and since she was driving fast, it was only for a split second. I had to stop myself from saying anything, but I had a feeling she knew anyway, just because of how fast she drove to get past the field and how she remained silent up until we were a good mile or 2 ahead of it. I know what I saw. But at the same time, I don't. I have no idea what it could have been. There are other reports that seem to follow more along the lines of traditional ghosts, and perhaps deal with a lost soul eternally wandering around the rows of corn. One report comes from Redditor Queen of Mary, claiming that this is an experience that her husband had while out fishing with his 3 friends. She explains the strange account. So one day, he was meeting his friends to go fishing on the river. His 3 friends were already down by the water, and he got there later with his dog. The river in town is separated by a cornfield. So they just had to park their cars by the road, walk through the field, and then they were at the riverbank. This happened in 2006 when our town had a bad flood. This was also late summer, so the corn was high. Half of the cornfield had been flooded, so the part by the road was still standing, but when you got farther out, it had been leveled by the flood. Anyway, he said he had an awful feeling while he was walking through the corn, and his dog kept barking. This dog is extremely well behaved but wouldn't stop even after my husband told him to. He said he felt really uneasy but brushed it off because it was a short walk, and then he emerged from the corn and walked the rest of the way to his friends. When he got down to the river, he said, they asked who it was that was walking with him. He said no one and asked what they were talking about. Well, I guess their faces turned white, and explained that a man walked out of the corn with them and then just turned around and walked back. He said he was sure they were serious and felt certain that a ghost was walking with him, and that's why he got that feeling and his dog was acting strange. In another very paranormal account, one Reddit poster tells of how he had been driving through central Illinois with some others on their way to Chicago. They had been driving along a remote stretch of I-55 that passes through rows after rows of cornfields as far as the eye could see when the witness noticed something decidedly odd. He says, "It was really late and everyone was asleep in the van except my friend's mom and me. I was sitting on the right side in the back when we passed by what looked like 2 teenagers coming out of the cornfield on the right side of the road. Now, normally that isn't that weird. Plenty of kids end up wandering through cornfields at some point in Illinois. What was weird was where they were and how they looked. I will never forget the boy. He was probably 15 or 16 years old, wearing a white linen shirt and brown pants with suspenders. His hair was short but curly and brown. He was handsome and pale with dark circles under his eyes, and I mean, like, Gerard Way, looking into eyes. He looked like he had blood on him, and the girl he was with looked bad. She was wearing a blood-covered dress and she was also pale with dark rings under her eyes. Now, where we were was really strange. That cornfield was huge, and there weren't any entrances off of I-55 that we could see. My friend's mom immediately freaked out, thinking they drove their car into the cornfield and must have been super hurt. We were driving pretty fast and she had a van full of kids, so instead of pulling over, she grabbed her Nokia and called 911. I remember that she reported the mile marker and told the police they looked like they needed help. And that was it. I never figured out what happened. I honestly think they were ghosts. Their movements were so strange and their placement was just so odd. There is no way teenagers would be hanging out on the side of I-55 dressed like that around midnight. In other cases, the cornfield itself seems to be imbued with some sort of supernatural energy, and our next report comes from the country of Ireland, concerning what seems to be a fairy-infested cornfield. Here, Reddit user Billies_Clonosaurus tells us, "Fairies aren't like Tinkerbell or whatever, they are powerful magical beings apparently. Don't fuck with fairies. On Irish farms, you will occasionally come across a tree or hedge in the middle of the field. They can often get in the way of harvests or whatever. But they are never cut down as they are seen as belonging to the fairies. The same with fairy forts, circular patterns of mushrooms, or ancient ringforts. The ringforts are where there used to be a raised wall or encampment, and they sometimes become overgrown with trees. If you wander into one, you are supposedly going to have bad luck unless you put your jumper inside out. The other thing is something I've had some experience with. It's called Fujimara, not sure how to spell it. Basically, when you're in a field and the fog descends, You cannot find the gate or any landmarks to find your way out. It happened to me twice. One was on Halloween and the other was a few years previous to that in a different area. Apparently, the links between the other world and this one get closer around Halloween. We ended up just walking and walking for what seemed like hours to get through the fields. Most Irish farms are small, which makes that even more confusing. It happened to a friend also on his farm. He took his Honda 50 out but spent 20 minutes circling around the field looking for the exit. Whether any of these stories are true or not, it would seem that cornfields are truly places that stir the imagination, and they are certainly menacing locales ripe for such stories. Whether these things described are ghosts, demons, or just the imagination playing tricks, the rows of corn are definitely mysterious and forbidding places, and such reports serve to entertain and scare.